All right, this is Anatomy Physiology lesson 10.02 on the anatomy of the neuron. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the, much like we did in the muscle physiology chapter, where we looked at how the muscle fiber contracts. What we're doing here is we're getting the microanatomy down for the neuron and the different regions of the neuron, so that when we talk about the conduction of a nerve impulse, we're familiar with the vocabulary. So to start off with, we're going to divide this neuron into three sections. We have, and I'm going to do this in pencil because we're going to be labeling the rest of this. I'm going to kind of put a box around this very lightly. And what I have here, and I'll just kind of do the box over here, is the cell body. So this is considered to be, this would be the cell body. And we learned that, when we have the body of the mandible or the body of a vertebra or the body of the stomach, it's kind of the main part. Coming off of that, we have branches here. So we have branches off of the cell body. And in this case, we have multiple branches. So these, we'll just put a check mark here. These are called dendrites. And you guys should recognize this. You've had the, so these are the check marks. You have the Latin term dendro. What does dendro mean? Did you say tree? Well, the reason these are called dendrites is these look like the branches on a tree. And then everything else, so everything that comes down here and is up here, so I'll just do my arrow here. This is the axon. So we can talk about, let's see, let's straighten this up a little bit. We can talk about our neuron in terms of, is it part of the cell body? Is it part of the dendrites, or is it part of the axon? Now you'll notice there's all of these little arrows. So before we go too far into, and then we have these big arrows here, let's talk about what these arrows mean. We have a direction for nerve impulse transmission. So this is the impulse transmission direction. So that means that if I'm going from a nerve cell to a nerve cell, I've got the axons at the end of another nerve here. Axons here. And they come into the dendrites. And we already talked about the synapse. And so here what we have going on is we'll have a synapse. Have a synapse here. We've got a synapse here, a synapse here. Then the signal travels down the dendrites into the cell body, down the axon, down to the axon terminals, and I'll have more dendrites down here. So these will be dendrites. And in that way, we go from a nerve cell to nerve cell. Now, at the end of this, sometimes we don't have dendrites, sometimes we have muscle fibers. And we talked about neuromuscular junctions. So what are these other pieces? A lot of these things we should already should be familiar to you. So when we this is in purple, so I'm just going to re-highlight mine in purple. What are we looking at there? Yep, that's the nucleus. We already said, let's color code these though, because yours is not in color. So let's make our dendrites orange. And these are the dendrites. We have substances in the cytoplasm of the cell body, just like we do with other cells. So what you're looking at here is probably a mitochondria, but you'll notice we've got this granular looking blue stuff, and I'll do this in light blue. This is called the Nissl substance or the Nissl bodies. Nissl, Nissl, Nissl substance, or Nissl bodies. It's called both. Whoops, got an S in there, sorry, bodies. And this is the equivalent of the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Rough endoplasmic reticulum. So it's a little bit different in a neuron than it is in a regular epithelial cell or any other kind of tissue. The cell membrane, if you remember, the cell membrane in, let me pick a different color than red, so it's offset. So the cell membrane in a muscle cell was called the sarcolemma, and sarco we know means muscle. So the cell membrane in a neuron is the neurolemma. And we'll be referring to the neurolemma quite often because the neurolemma is really involved, and the neurolemma continues all the way down, it lines the axon. Now we've got these strange structures that are on the axon, but this would be neurolemma here on the outside. This would be neurolemma. So the outside of the cell is all neurolemma. And if we can take a second to appreciate just the oddness of this, when we've looked at epithelial tissues, you know, when we've looked at a lot of connective tissues, they have that typical kind of round animal cell look. This is completely different. And we really didn't spend any time in biology talking about that. So we said that this entire structure, and I'm just going to kind of make this in black, the whole kit and caboodle is called an axon. So the axon goes all the way down, and down here at the ends, we have the axon terminals, which just means the ends of the axon. And we learned in the neuromuscular junction chapter, when we talked about synapses, that these guys, let's pick light green, are called the synaptic knobs. So axon terminal kind of refers to the fact that you're at the end of the axon. The synaptic knobs are the specific structures. And again, in review, you'll remember that these guys hold the neurotransmitters and vesicles. Okay, so what's going on with these? What are these guys? Well, we have basically fat cells. So each one of these represents a fat cell. And what happens in a lot of neurons, now not every neuron has these fat cells, but each of these fat cells has a name. They're called Schwann cells. So this is one Schwann cell, SCHWANN. And this is a Schwann cell. And this is a Schwann cell. And they're basically cells that are just wrapped fat. Wrapped layers of fat. What we're going to see is having these fat cells wrapped around the axon make the impulse transmission much more efficient. It can transmit a lot faster. And the reason is, instead of trying to conduct along the whole length of the axon, the signal will jump from these gaps. So we have this long line, but actually the signal will kind of jump from here to here to here to here to here to these gaps. And the gaps have a name too. Gaps are called nodes of Ranvier. Nodes of RANVIER. So again, we've got this fat layer. And by the way, when we look at all of the fat cells as one, we call the whole layer of fat along the whole axon the myelin sheath. So we've got the term myelin sheath, MYELINSHEATH. A sheath is something that covers, and myelin is the substance. So these are all of the fat as a single unit. But again, this really improves the transmission for the nerve impulse because we don't have to conduct. So if up here is a regular nerve signal, it has to go along the whole way on an unmyelinated axon. If I'm on a myelinated axon, I'm going to go, and you can see how far ahead this finger is than this finger because you can jump. And again, we'll definitely get into the details of that later. So what are our takeaways? We have similarities between a nerve cell and an epithelial cell in that we have a nucleus, we've got a mitochondria, we've got a cell body, we've got a cell membrane, although we give it a different name. Let's add that on there. This is the cell membrane. But nerve cells, basically neuron is a nerve cell, look very different. We have these processes that come out called dendrites. We have one long process that comes out called the axon that ends in terminals and has synaptic knobs. Our rough endoplasmic reticulum is called Nissl substance. Oh, and I can see a label that I forgot. Sorry about this. Let's see, what color have I not used? Let's go with light purple. Where the cell body drops down into the axon is called the axon hillock. Hillock means little hill. So this is the axon hillock here. We have all these processes that come into the cell body. We have, in this case, one long process that goes out. And in addition, not only do we have this long process, but it's covered in this fat called a myelin sheath made up of these individual Schwann cells. And again, more details on this to follow. The gaps between them are called the nodes of Ranvier, and those help the nerve impulse conduct. The direction of impulse is dendrite into cell body and down the axon. Okay, so those are all the basics that you need to know about neuron anatomy, and let's go on to 10:03.